Hello, everyone out there. I'm seeing that the room is filling up, and look at all the people. This is very, very exciting. And we welcome you to the Lake Country Clean Waters quarterly meeting, Lake Responses to Wisconsin's Changing Winters. And I know there's so many people that are excited about this. I'm Caroline Joyce. I'm a co-host, and I'm also part of the the Lake Country Clean Waters Board. And we want to introduce you to our other host. And Paul, you want to say your name?
Hi there. My name is Paul Muir. I work for Tall Pines Conservancy as their land protection manager. I will be your co-host today, and I will be sort of monitoring the chat inbox, which we'll use to ask any questions during our presentation, and make sure that your questions get presented to our panel here. So happy to be a part of this and helping out.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm going to be looking at lakes exactly the same way in wintertime as I have been. I see the ice cover and I think of ice skating, ice boating, ice fishing. And I have changed my view on all of this after meeting our speaker that you're going to meet later. So we're going to get started, and we're going to take a look at Lake Country Clean Waters in a couple of different ways. And we're going to have John Macy help us with this. He's going to be looking at all of you and how you participate, and then how our board participates. So are you ready, John?
Yes, I am. And thank you very much, Carolyn, and welcome everyone. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules at this holiday season to join us for this, what I consider to be a very exciting topic. The board has talked about it for several months. We thought it was timely, and we thought it would be interesting to all of you lake lovers. As Carolyn has briefly stated, this is our Lake Country Clean Waters quarterly meeting. And Lake Country Clean Waters, as most of you know, but just to make sure Lake Country Clean Waters is dedicated to promoting the conservation of Lake Country's lakes, rivers, streams, and groundwater. We strive to achieve our goal by promoting communication and acting as a sounding board for special districts, associations, conservation groups, municipalities, and in particular tonight, community leaders. So again, thank you all for joining us and participating in tonight's quarterly meeting. I have the privilege of introducing the board tonight, and I could go into great detail setting forth all of their accomplishments because all of our members of our board are extremely accomplished, but that detail is set forth on our bios on the website, and I invite you to go to the website and check that out. As I said, they're all extremely involved at all levels, promoting the conservation of Lake Country waters. I'll just mention them by name and give their professions. Don Gallo is an attorney. He's our president, and he's an attorney concentrating in environmental practice. Susan Buchanan is the executive director of Tall Pines Conservancy. Joyce Chevitt is a former commercial banker, and now it works in public relations firm. Denise Gergen is our vice president. She's a retired attorney. Alan Barrows is manager of Waukesha County Department of Parks and Land Use. I'm an attorney concentrating in municipal law. Carolyn Joyce is an educator at the UWM Great Lakes area and staff for the UW School of Continuing Education. Tom Kepp is the manager of the Lake Pewaukee Sanitary District, and a special shout out to Tom's Pewaukee chapter of Walleyes for Tomorrow, which is holding their meeting tonight and apparently joining us in mass. So I think we all wish we were with you, and we welcome that entire group this evening also. Stephanie Krubek serves as our executive director. Her company, Purevent Living, which stands for Health, Wellness, the Environment, and Giving Back. Again, it's a remarkable group of dedicated individuals with incredible knowledge, experience, and talent. Time does not allow, as I said, to go into every detail of all of their accomplishments, but I personally want to thank all of the board members for all the work that they do to promote this organization. So Carolyn, I'll turn it back to you and we'll go on to the next slides. And
oh, you're going to be very shocked, John, because your talk about thank you for your time and contributions is coming up, and hopefully you see that on the screen. So here we go.
So we have, as I've indicated, we work with different districts, association, conservation groups, municipality, and community members. And we need to thank all of you, because without you and your input and providing information to us, our organization couldn't exist. So we have a list of the organizations that, I think that's the next slide, the organizations that have
Next slide.
that have participated over the years, and this isn't all of the organizations and lake districts in our area, but those who have from this body, and hopefully we'll be adding to that list after tonight's presentation, because we do ask many of you to indicate what organizations you belong with. But we have a slide showing the organizations that have been listed with us over the years. So can we show that, Carolyn? Or
It's basically you have the Lake District contributions and sponsors that are with us, and the organizational contributions and events and things that have also been with us on this particular slide. And if you know more, please add to it.
yeah, I don't have the slide up. That's why I couldn't go to it. Is the slide up for everybody else?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I'm not seeing it, Caroline. I don't think it's advancing.
Okay, it's up on our screens. And we have, okay. So I would like to ask someone in the audience if they would let us know if they can see it. Because you're in our
I think we're just seeing the title screen, Caroline, that says Lake Country Clean Water. Thank you for your time.
okay, and here's the next slide.
Okay, there we go.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, I'm so sorry. All right, there you are, John.
Well, actually, there was a slide before that we skipped, but we don't, yeah, there it is. So this is your chance for all of the approximately 75 people who have joining us tonight to quickly skim through this thank you note and see if your organization is listed. Again, if your organization, Lake District, Management District, or Homeowners Association is listed, that means that you or a member of your organization has participated in the relatively near past at either our Healthy Lakes Conference, by contributions or otherwise. And we want to make sure this list, as Carolyn has noted, grows after tonight and in the future for all of our programming and different activities. So we tried to put them in alphabetical order to help you look for your group, but this is just a shout out to those organizations and to you members that have promoted us and helped us over the past few years. The next slide is with the greater particularity showing those lake districts and organizations that have financially or otherwise helped us out over the last few years. We ask that you consider taking this to your management districts meetings, the annual meeting in particular, or any business that you think that might be of similar ilk and want to help us out. And again, a very special thank you to these lake districts and organizations and companies that have financially supported us over the last few years. I would be remiss not to mention that Tall Pines Conservancy has been a huge asset and helpful to us over the last few years, and their in-kind contributions have been tremendous, and we want to make a special thank you to the Tall Pines Conservancy for all of their kind support. If you aren't familiar with all of their hard work and all of the great work that they do, it's another organization that you should check out and become knowledgeable about. Lastly, it's to all of you, the individuals. We accept contributions from you, believe it or not, and many of you have contributed over the years. You'll be asked to contribute if you're on our list, and we hope that you give due consideration. I know it sounds like a cliche, and all organizations say it, but every dollar helps. So I was at a meeting recently where somebody said, you know, you should ask everybody to give, and then you ask them to give just a little bit more. So it hurts a little bit, is the way he put it. So if you were thinking of giving us $5, please consider giving us $6. If you're willing to give us $25, try to give us $30. Again, we use, none of us are paid. We're all volunteers, and we use the money wisely to help the organization, and because we are dedicated to promoting the conservation of Lake Country's lakes, rivers, streams, and groundwater. So thank you again very much for joining us. And Carolyn, I turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, John. And now what we're going to take a look at, because this is sort of the platform, the backbone of all of our things, is our programming. And how does Lake Country Clean Water connect you with water resources through their programming? And I want to introduce Joyce Shepard from the Lake Country Clean Waters Board. Are we loading for that one? Yes, there we are. So Joyce, we're going to have you take it away, and I think your images will be coming up soon.
Okay, as Caroline mentioned, I'm Joyce Shepard. I'm the treasurer of the organization. And along with Don Gallo and Susan Buchanan, I'm one of the founders of Lake Country Clean Waters, which actually has been in existence now. I can't believe it. It's almost 9 years. And as we've mentioned, our organization was created to facilitate education and communication among lake groups, lake leaders, and lake residents. So I want to take a look at how we do that. So you want to go to the next slide, Caroline?
Yes.
Our first thing is we host an annual conference called the Healthy Lakes Conference, which is a day-long conference where we bring in experts who present on topics and areas of concern to our lake groups. This past September, if you attended, I think was probably the best one we've had yet. Our keynote speaker was Stephanie Prowitz, who is CEO of the Green Lake Association. And she laid out for us Green Lake's challenges and their unified approach to raising funds through storytelling to fund the various unique and inventive projects that they're implementing on that lake. And then following her presentation, we had other experts covering the topics of phosphorus capture programs, early identification of aquatic invasive species using eDNA. We had an overview of the North Lake Dredging Project, a presentation on harmful algal blooms, and then we had a presentation of the Mason Creek remeandering project, and a lot of other different topics that really stimulated a lot of conversation and questions among those who attend. And when John was talking earlier about donations, your donations actually helped to keep the cost of this conference down. I think it was like $45 to attend a day-long conference that included lunch. So we are hoping that you will be able to attend our next conference. We've had it at the Oconomowoc Community Center for the past couple of years. And in 2024, we're going to try having it at the Oconomowoc Lake Club, which is on beautiful Oconomowoc Lake and just a minute or two off of Highway 16. So it should be convenient to all. So mark your calendars for Thursday, September 19th. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll be getting some information later on in the year about the conference and how to sign up. If you're not on our email list, I would suggest going to info, or sending an email rather, to info@lakecountrycleanwaters.org, and send us your email address and we'll make sure you get our communications. The other thing about it's not just education at these conferences, it is the ability to meet with people from other lakes, to network and to discuss and share important information that might help solve problems on all of the lakes. The next thing that we do is the Lake Country Clean Water Festival. This was actually started 13 years ago by the Pewaukee Lake Water Ski Club, but for the past 2 years, Lake Country Clean Waters has hosted it. And what it is the centerpiece of the whole festival is we have a very large tent on the beach at Lakefront Park in downtown Pewaukee, and have several different groups come in to provide education that is geared for families and mostly children, to help them understand the aspects of lake ecology and the role that we all play in keeping our lakes clean and healthy. So we have groups like Tall Pines Conservancy, Waukesha Green Team, Carroll University, Waukesha County, Lake Pewaukee Sanitary District, Walleyes for Tomorrow, and the Pewaukee River Partnership, and others who have interactive displays that kids and families can take advantage of to learn more about the lakes. And I have, again, a shout out to Tom Kep. Tom is always at our festival. And on the morning of the festival, he goes to the Pewaukee River and finds fish and tadpoles, crawfish, turtles, frogs, all kinds of things for the kids to see. So it really is a hands-on way for kids and families to learn about our lakes. And then lastly, we host quarterly meetings like the meeting that we're having right now tonight. And we pick a topic that seems to be of particular interest to the group and find an expert to come and talk to us about that. We realize that many of you on this call are snowbirds. So to facilitate these meetings, we will have the winter and spring meetings via Zoom so that everybody can participate. We'll have another meeting in June that will be an in-person event. And so finally, we're coming up. Our next meeting, might want to save the date, is March the 7th. That will also be an online Zoom event, so there will be some information coming out about that. Our initial thought for that meeting was to review the results of the University of Minnesota St. Anthony's Falls study, their additional research on wake sports. Caroline, who is on the board of Wisconsin Lakes, learned this week that research has been delayed. So we're not sure if that's going to be the topic for that event or not. It's kind of to be determined, so we'll let you know. But one thing that we wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of is that there has been some legislation that's being written and introduced. One bill is being written by a representative and a senator from northern Wisconsin. And then we just learned about another piece that's being written by a state senator from De Pere that would regulate wake surf boats on our lakes. So what I would suggest, there's a lot of information out in the media. There is information on Wisconsin Lakes website, wisconsinlakes.org. And I would suggest for the time being that it would be good to go to Wisconsin Lakes website, sign up for their newsletter so that you will be informed of what's going on. There's just a lot of activity right now. So with that, I will hand it back to Caroline.
Well, thank you very much for really doing that nice coverage of it, because each one of those opportunities has been great. But now we know that you're all sitting out there, and we're going to be going with our guest speaker. And you're probably going to have lots of questions that you want to ask. And so I'm going to pass this over to the co-host, Paul, to tell you how you can input the questions you may have as we move along. Paul?
Yeah, so at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a chat box. We'll have everyone enter questions via the chat box, and I will monitor those questions and pass them on to Zach.
But they're all turned, their sound is turned off, so
Correct.
that's the way they'll be doing that. Okay,
Correct,
all
yep.
right. Okay, so I hope everybody understands, and we want your great questions. All right, so now this leads us right into our speaker, and I'm so excited about this. First of all, I want to introduce him, and he's Dr. Zach Feiner. And he is a fisheries research scientist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Limnology. He also co-chairs the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts Fisheries Working Group and serves on the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership Science and Data Team. Zach's research focuses on recreational fishing dynamics and climate change impacts on Wisconsin's fish and fisheries. So without further ado, lake responses to Wisconsin's changing winters. Zach, take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I need sharing to be enabled, and I will be able to share my screen and with all you folks.
Okay, please share.
But thank you for the invitation to speak with your group tonight. It's exciting to see so many people here, and it sounds like there are even more people, because it sounds like there are groups of people out there too. So yes, please do feel free to enter as many questions as you like. I'm happy to hang around and chat and answer questions afterward. All right, so let me share my screen here. Okay, and everybody's seen the kind of full screen PowerPoint presentation? Great, perfect. Great, so so as we've talked about, I'm gonna be talking to you folks today about Wisconsin's changing winters and how lakes seem to be responding to those changes. And I just wanna start off the bat by pointing out that I'm not the only name on this slide. You're gonna hear me say we a lot tonight. And when I say we, I'm using the academic we, which means usually somebody else. But the idea here is that this is a source of pretty intense research interest at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at the Wisconsin DNR. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of other folks' research here that all kind of ties together into a bigger picture. And I always like to start off by asking folks, who doesn't love a Wisconsin winter, right? We're getting into it now. There's so many great things going on you can do. You can ice fish and ski and sled. There's beautiful winter scenery, right? And, sometimes there's some bumps, or maybe drifts is a better word, in the road. You might have to wear those cleats when you walk the dog. I like to think of shoveling as exercise rather than a burden. But, but the story here is that really we are living in a place where we get months and months of cold weather. And the natural ecosystems on our landscape, including our lakes, are adapted to that cold. And when that cold changes, that causes changes in those ecosystems. And that's what really this whole talk is about. And when I talk about cold and kind of seasonal cycles in lakes, I just kind of want to start off with this intro, is that lakes are kind of living almost organisms, you can think of it. We can think of lakes as almost having like a metabolism in a seasonal cycle that really sets up how they function over the year, right? So this is a nice kind of little cartoon. I might turn on a laser pointer here so you can all see what I'm pointing at. But the idea here is that, you have spring kind of mixed season, and then you go into the summer, and very deep lakes will actually stratify. We can have warm water on top and cold water on the bottom, and we'll talk about that later in the talk. And then in the fall, you get that turnover event. Like anglers really like to think about this fall turnover, and it's really a good time to be fishing. And in the winter, you have cold water and ice on top. And I think a lot of people look at a lake and they just see ice, and they assume it's cold, it's dark under the ice, there's nothing going on, Ice anglers might have a little bit of a different opinion, because we know the fish are at least eating because you're catching fish through the ice. But the idea is that for a long time, we've thought of the winter period in lakes as pretty stagnant time. It looks like my laser pointer is not quite working the way I want, so I might turn that off. So what I want to point out is that these seasonal cycles are really important for how different organisms reproduce and live and thrive in our lakes. They're adapted to these seasonal cycles. They're adapted to these cold, cold winters. So you have things like zooplankton, like these Daphnia here. You might also hear them called water fleas. They're these little kind of basically cheeseburgers of the lake, right? They're really important food sources for fish. And they have, during the summer, they kind of go along and they reproduce clonally and everything, and click right along. And then in the wintertime or in the fall, when it starts to get cold, they'll reproduce sexually and they'll create these little resting eggs. And those will go down in the sediment, and those overwinter in the sediment, and then they'll hatch in the springtime again. So that's where a lot of your zooplankton production is coming from in the spring, is from these resting eggs that are created to survive the winter. The same idea goes for fish species, so we have like walleye or lake whitefish. These species are very strongly triggered by seasonal cues. So walleye, I think a lot of people are familiar with. They spawn in the spring. They're being cued by things like when the ice melts, when the temperatures start to warm up, and the conditions in the springtime can be really important then for how well that spawning goes. Lake whitefish and lake trout are on the opposite end of the spectrum. They actually spawn in the fall, and then the conditions during winter actually will determine how many of their eggs survive. Those eggs are actually overwintering and they'll hatch. So if you have good ice conditions, you might have more eggs survive than if you have poor ice conditions. So winter becomes really important, not just for kind of what's going down during the winter, but also setting up what happens in kind of the spring and into the summer. So it becomes concerning then that we're facing this changing climate, which is something that I work on a lot. But the idea here is that we're having wetter and warmer weather over time in Wisconsin, and that's what these maps on the left hand are showing here. This is some data from WICI, the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, just showing that especially in the southern part of the state, we're having wetter weather, and throughout the state we're getting warmer weather. And I think this is a really nice illustration. This is actually a pretty cool website, this map on the right here. You can go in and type in any location, and it'll show you kind of a heat map of what your weather is going to look like in 2080. So if you type in central Wisconsin, this heat map is suggesting that by 2080, central Wisconsin is going to have weather more similar to like a central Illinois or a northern Missouri, right? Very, very different weather than what we're used to now, especially when you think about winter weather. And I think in a lot of ways, these changes are already here. Like we're already feeling those changes in a lot of aspects of our lives, right? Every single winter, you have these news articles about open water or short ice fishing seasons. We've had instances where major recreational events like the Winnebago sturgeon spearing season or the Birkebeiner ski race, gets canceled or gets shortened because if you don't have enough snow and have enough ice. So we're already starting to feel the effects of these warmer winters, and the predictions are that those are only going to get more and more intense as time goes on. And we're starting to feel those, particularly in our lakes, in the fact that our ice seasons are getting shorter, or in some cases, we're even starting to miss ice in winter. So one thing I want to point out is that Wisconsin is actually really lucky. We have these really cool, really long-term data sets where people have gone out and they've taken note of when the ice melts in the spring and freezes in the fall on a couple of lakes for a long, long time. So Lake Mendota, which is on this graph, it's this kind of blue line here. That data set goes back to 1900. So that's 120 some years now of people recording when ice goes on and when ice goes off these Lake Mendota. We also have some lakes up in the northern part of the state, Escanaba and Sparkling, that have 50 to 30 time series of data. And what all of these show is if you fit kind of a trend line to them, this is ice off date. So when the ice melts in the spring, you see that this is getting earlier over time across lakes. So in general, springs are warmer, ice is melting earlier. And what's interesting is that, we're already kind of on the edge of a landscape where we won't always get ice in the wintertime, which I think is a really big change when you think about, going back to your childhood, being able to be out on the ice all the time during the winter. What this map is showing is all these dots are lakes, and it's showing with a little bit of warming, about 2 degrees or 3 degrees Celsius of warming, which is this purple and yellow band, and here's Wisconsin right here. We're going to move into a regime where we get intermittent ice in the winter. That means not every winter we're going to have ice, and when it does freeze, it's not going to stay. It's going to be on and off instead of freezing solid, and you can go out and fish and do whatever. So we're already probably facing a change where we're going to lose ice on a lot of our lakes in the wintertime. And the point of this talk is to think about what that means for how the lakes work. So yes, exactly my next slide. So what does this mean? What do changing snow and ice conditions mean for lakes is one question we're going to ask. And then the second question that we're going to talk about is how does changing ice phenology, which I'll define later, it's the kind of seasonality of things, affect lakes and the fish that live in them. So first part is what happens during the winter and what's going on there. And then the second part is how does that melting of ice affect kind of how the lake functions throughout the rest of the year. So just to kind of set you up and give you a sense of where a lot of this research is taking place, most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is coming from a set of research lakes in Vilas County, which is in the far northern part of Wisconsin. University of Wisconsin-Madison has a Trout Lake Station, which is a research station on Trout Lake here. And the DNR has a research station on Escanaba Lake over here. So there's a lot of really great data coming from this area where these research stations have been collecting data for 40, 50, 60 years. And that's a lot of the really useful data that we've been able to use to think about how changing winters are going to affect our Wisconsin lakes. So the first thing I want to talk about is actually something that's probably the most basic about winter on lakes, right? Is just the ice itself. And, you know, I think a lot of times you look out at a lake and it's frozen and you're like, all right, well, that's just kind of a homogeneous mass of ice. There's nothing really interesting going on there. But what's really cool is if you cut into that ice, you find out that not all ice is created equal. So what you can have in a lot of cases, this is a picture of a block of ice that was cut out of Trout Lake, I believe. And you can actually get layers to that ice. And you can have, for example, very clear ice under certain conditions, which is the bottom half of this layer. You call that blue ice or clear ice or black ice sometimes. And then you can also have ice that gets a lot of like snow or slush or other things mixed into it or a lot of air bubbles in it, and you get a lot of white ice. And that's what this top layer is. And the reason it's important to think about kind of different types of ice is because they act very differently when it comes to light. And light is a major driver of what happens in the water, especially in the winter and the spring. And the idea here is if you have ice where you have a lot of white ice or snow on top, and then you have clear ice underneath, that's actually, that white ice or snow is reflecting the light off of the snow and it's not penetrating into the lake. So it's actually making the lake much darker. It's reflecting a lot of the light that could be, and heat that could be absorbed into the lake. However, if you have clear ice and not much snow or not much white ice, that light can penetrate into the lake and it can drive things like photosynthesis. So the idea is that the snow is working as kind of an insulator or a blocker of this light and can possibly change the environment of the lake from winter to winter or even from day to day. And what's interesting is that, you know, across over time, this is just a map of snow and ice depths in January on Sparkling Lake, Wisconsin, which is up nearby Trout Lake. And you can see the depths of snow vary a lot and the depths of blue ice or that clear ice vary a lot over time, right? You can have years like 2004 here, we have tons of blue ice and very little snow. And you can have years like 2015 where you have lots of snow and lots of blue ice and so on and so forth. So the question then becomes, how does the kind of all that wiggliness and what the ice is made out of from year to year affect what's going on under the ice? And that's the first question that we're going to be talking about today. And the way we looked at that, and again, that's the academic I was not actually involved in this study. So these are some really intrepid scientists at the CFL that did this work, is that using a whole lake manipulation, some scientists at the CFL, Hilary Dugan, Adriana Gorski, and Ellie Socha worked to test what happens when you change snow and ice conditions. And the way they did this was, some people might think it's crazy, other people might just think it's brilliant, is they actually took a small bog lake in up northern Wisconsin, Trout Bog, and snowplowed it for 2 winters. So in other words, every time it snowed, they would get on this snow machine here and go out and blow all the snow off the lake. So the idea was to see what happens when you remove snow. And then they had the first year of the study where they left the snow on and they wanted to compare what happens when you have snow versus when you don't. And what they found was actually pretty interesting. The first thing was actually kind of an accidental discovery. So what happened is the first year they left the snow on, sure, whatever, great. The second year, the ice didn't form quickly enough and thick enough for them to be able to get that snowplow out, and you can't really hand shovel the whole lake, right? So they had a lot of snow they had to leave on while that early ice was forming, and it led to the formation of a lot of white ice, which is what these gray bars here in this plot are. So you had lots of white ice and then some black ice. So they call that their kind of white ice year. And then in the third year, they had a lot of really great ice form and not much snow early on, and they were able to keep the snow off, and they got a lot of black ice and not much white ice. And that's what they called their black ice year. So it led to a nice contrast across the 3 years where they had their reference year, leave the snow on, a white ice year, and a black ice year. And that's what these dashed lines are kind of denoting the different years. So what they found when they started looking at things like light and water clarity and algae abundance under the ice is that I think the first one makes a lot of sense. When you have less snow and less white ice, you get more light penetration into the water, which is something we just talked about, right? So in these first 2 years, you see virtually no light penetration, which is what these kind of yellow bars are showing, how far the light penetrates into the water. And then in the year where you have mainly black ice and not much white ice or snow, you get lots of light penetration. So great. In other words, this is a great kind of sanity test that worked. Whenever they're able to keep the snow off the ice, they get more light into the lake. But what was interesting is that because they had more light, they also got more algae, especially in that black ice year. And that's what this, I'm going to skip all the way down to the bottom of this graph this is chlorophyll A, which is just an indicator of kind of how much green there is in the water, and the indicator of how much algae you have in the water. So if you see, especially during that snow year, the first year, they got virtually no algae. They get a little bit when they have the white ice, and then in the black ice year, they have lots and lots of algae. So there's a point way up here, for example. And because they had a lot more algae in the water, I'm just going to quickly go up to the second one, this kind of panel C here. They had less water clarity. So this is a Secchi depth reading. A lot of people might have seen those black and white discs that people lower down into the water. The idea here is that the length of this bar is how far down into the lake you can actually see that disc. So it's an idea of water clarity. They had very clear year, though kind of snowy year, and then less and less water clarity when you had clearer and clearer ice. So very clear evidence then that just by removing snow, letting the light penetrate the ice, you can get changes in kind of your water clarity and your algal abundance in the lake. But they didn't stop there. They actually went and took these algae samples and zooplankton samples and went through and actually counted all these different species and types of algae and zooplankton, because they wanted to understand how does the community change with these different ice conditions as well. Right. So it could be that maybe you have lots of algae in 2 years, but they're totally different kinds of algae that do different things. That means that's important to figure out too, right? So when they did that, what they found is that you get, some algal production in the snow and white ice years, which is kind of what this first kind of section of this plot is showing, a little bit more in the white ice year, and then tons and tons in the black ice year. And what they found is that the two types that increased the most were the chlorophytes, which are your kind of, garden variety green algae, and your cyanophytes, which is an interesting one. It's their blue-green algae. So you get lots of this algal production. And it's mostly these chlorophytes and cyanophytes. I'm not saying that there's a harmful algal bloom occurring under the ice in these lakes, but it's interesting that it's driving the production of these two specific types of algae. And it could be setting them up to have more dominance further down the line as the year goes on. They did the same thing for zooplankton, which I'm going to touch on really quickly. I'm a fisheries guy, and so I'm going to do my best on the zooplankton data. But the idea here, again, is if you just look at pure density of zooplankton in the snow and black ice, the snow year and the white ice year, on this bottom left plot, those first two kind of sections are totally blank, right? So no zooplankton in the 2 years where there's not much light penetration and not much algae. In the year where you just have black ice and lots of light penetration, you get tons and tons of zooplankton, which is pretty interesting. So you need to have that food around, and that actually can drive higher zooplankton abundances. And the second thing they found is that the zooplankton communities, so what types of zooplankton were around, were very different from year to year. And that's kind of shown in this other plot, this panel B on the bottom here. I'm not going to ask you to read all those names because frankly, I don't know all of them either. But the idea is that just by looking at the colors of the bars, you can tell how much the community has changed from year to year. You get very different colors from year to year in the snow year, the white ice year, and the black ice year. And the two, you get very over-dominated communities by these Ascomorpha and Asplantia rotifers in the black ice year in particular. So you get a much more kind of homogeneous community in the black ice year as well. But this is again showing that just by letting that light through, you're completely changing what's going on under the ice, right? You can get more or less algae, you can get more or less zooplankton and different types of zooplankton occurring in your lakes. So the take home of that is that these under ice environments are really dynamically responding to what's occurring with the ice itself. And just by changing from based on how the ice forms, or literally going out and snow plowing it. Just by changing how much light can get through that ice, you can completely change the underlying community in the lake from year to year. So, and you can also do things like change habitat. So if you have more algae, maybe they're producing more oxygen, you can have a more oxygenated habitat, or versus if you have less algae, maybe you get less oxygen production. So you can have very different habitats under the ice because of what the ice itself is doing. So that brings us back to this point. So if ice is super important and we're getting less and less ice over time, right? What does that mean for how these systems are going to function? When they start to lose ice, or you have very short ice years, or have intermittent ice years, that is probably going to change how these systems function, because they are adapted to having this thick ice layer on top of the lakes over the winter. When that goes away, that's a completely different system and different set of challenges that these systems have to face. So that's where we're going to change places now and kind of move into the idea of phenology. So phenology is the study of cyclic or seasonal natural phenomena, right? So it's when flowers bloom in the spring, or birds migrate in the fall, or fish spawn, or it's when you want to take that lovely fall drive and see the leaves in northern Wisconsin, or something like that, right? It's this kind of seasonal progression of events that's going on all around us all the time. And the timing of those is really the study of phenology. And the reason we care about phenology is that phenology is unique in that we have some of the longest ecological records anywhere are phenological data. So we have ancient Chinese and Japanese literatures going back to the 10th century BC, 800s AD, right? Thousands of years, literally going back, where we can understand the timing of events that were occurring in China in the 10th century BC all the way up to now, right? And there are lots of other different data sets we have. We have in the Americas, we have Thoreau's records. We also have Aldo Leopold's records from Wisconsin. He was a great kind of champion of phenological data. So it becomes very, very useful when you have all of these great baselines, because that's how you understand how much things have changed, right? If we had no idea what the timing of stuff was 50 years ago, we wouldn't know whether today was normal or not. So, but having that data creates a really, really important benchmark to really understand how much climate change has shifted the kind of seasonality of our systems. So the value of that data is really, really important for our understanding of how climate change is affecting our ecology. And the other reason we care about phenology is phenology, I think, whether we are conscious of it or not, informs how we interact with the world every single day, right? So a lot of times you can use one cue to inform another cue. An example I like to use is, this is a picture of some morel mushrooms. This is actually from my family land in Sauk County. Morels are delicious, and a lot of people like to go out and harvest them in the spring. But I live in Madison, and my family land is an hour away. So I can't just walk out the back door and see if the morels are there, right? But so you see a lot of these people say, oh, when the dandelions have all three different types of blooms, right? Like the kind of closed up one and the flower and the puffball, that's when the morels are out. Or when the lilacs bloom, that's when the morels are out, right? So people are using one kind of phenological event or cue, the dandelions or the lilacs, to inform when they go to harvest a different thing that happens seasonally, like mushrooms. And you see this kind of everywhere when you start to look for it, which is really interesting. Another really important one that's going to show up later in this talk. So in the springtime, Ojibwe tribal fishers go up and they harvest walleye, and they target the spawning runs. This is something that's been going on for thousands of years. It's a culturally and traditionally important relationship that the tribes have with their fish relative, the walleye, their oga. And what their traditional knowledge holds, that you go spearing when you start hearing the spring peepers sing in the springtime and the ice melts. So they're using this like almost terrestrial cue, right? This for the peeper calling, to inform when to go harvest in this aquatic environment. So you can think of years where maybe these two cues are very divergent, right? This peepers sing really early and the walleye are not spawning yet. That can actually influence the tribe's relationship with walleye and their ability to actually spear them and collect this really important subsistence fishery. And another way phenology informs how we interact with the world, actually literally informs how we write the rule book in some cases, right? So for example, a lot of fish spawn in the spring. There's some picture of some largemouth bass there. And in Wisconsin and a lot of other places, we actually close fishing or restrict fishing in the springtime to allow those fish to spawn kind of undisturbed because they're more vulnerable when they're spawning to angling. Same thing for deer. You know, we deer hunt in the fall. It's a good time because that's when the kind of fawns are grown up and moved off. But it's also when the rut's happening, deer moving around, where they're more likely to have some harvest and have some better luck there. So timing our hunting seasons to when, you know, the rut is occurring is another way we kind of phenologically inform when we go out and interact with our landscape. So when you start to kind of look at it, phenology informs everything, and you're taking the information in all the time, whether you kind of realize it or not, right? Like if I look out my window, there's a little bit of snow on the ground, the trees are bare, I know it's late fall. You know what, it's time to get the warm clothes out, you know, it's time to get the snowblower ready. Like the phenology is informing what I'm doing every single day. So to go back to this, now the question becomes, what is the phenology of lakes doing and how is it affecting how those lakes are functioning? So I've shown this slide a bunch of times now. So this is ice, again, this is ice off date. This is this kind of day of year over time for 3 different lakes. And you can see if you kind of look at those slopes, they're all kind of going down, which signifies that ice off is getting earlier and earlier over time. But the thing I always point out is that, you know what, the world is not totally predictable and you have lots and lots of bouncing around. So the actual observed ice off dates are all these points on the lines here. And there's tons of variability here, which is interesting. So one of the questions we had is like, well, what's happening with this variability? Because so far, a lot of the phenological research we've done has really focused on those overall trends. Okay, stuff is getting earlier or ice duration is getting shorter. What's that mean? But it turns out ice off is not just getting earlier in the year, it's also getting really, really weird and really, really unpredictable. So this is taking those same plot, but now we're actually calculating the variance in ice off date in 5-year windows. I'm not going to get too far into the stats, but the idea is essentially for every 5 years, we calculate how unpredictable ice off is. And if you can see me waving my hands in front of my camera, it's because I'm trying to show like if it's bouncing up and down a lot, or if it's not bouncing up and down very much, you can get low variance or high variance. And the idea here is that, you know, for 80 years of this 100-year time series, the variance is pretty low. It kind of clicked along, kind of down at the bottom of this graph, doing whatever. Then all of a sudden in the late 90s, early 2000s, you see these massive spikes in variance. So all of a sudden we're getting these years where we're whiplashing back and forth from really late to really early ice offs and back. And that becomes the question of what happens now. And I think this is a really good example of this is actually what happened in 2012 and 2013, right? So in 2012, ice out occurred on March 20th, which is crazy early. Trout Lake Station, they abruptly ended their winter sampling because they dropped a truck through the ice in February, which they're used to being able to drive well until March out on the ice. And all of a sudden the ice is too thin to drive a truck on in February. It's very, very unexpected. So you have this crazy early ice out in 2012. And in 2013, the very next year, the ice didn't go off on the lake until May 10th. That's almost 2 months later, just in the span of a single year into the timing of ice off. And now students are going up to Trout Lake. Everybody's getting ready to do their spring and summer sampling, and there's 2 feet of ice on the lake, and then there's still snow on the ground. They're still trying to snow plow out the driveways to Trout Lake, right? So you have in a single year an almost 2-month difference, a 50-day difference from when ice melted from one year to the next. And the question becomes then, if the lake is used to, and the animals that live in the lake are used to kind of being able to predict when ice goes off, right? Late April up north. And all of a sudden we're going from March to May in a single year. How can they handle that? And what does that mean for how those lakes are functioning? And the reason this is important is because that lakes have what we kind of call ecological memory. So the idea here is that lake ice off, like we kind of talked about already, like how the ice kind of informs what's going on underneath the ice, right? So you can have very different zooplankton and algal communities from year to year. Well, that feeds into how the rest of the year looks. So the timing of ice off and the ice conditions actually feed into what the lake does for the rest of the year, right? If you have a very early ice off, you can get a lot of heat into the lake very, very early. You can have a warmer lake, you might have lower oxygen concentrations, maybe have higher primary production and lower water quality or clarity, excuse me. So the idea here is that you can have very different conditions from year to year based on when that lake's ice goes off. So that ecological memory of that ice off can feed into habitat for fish or zooplankton or algae for the rest of the year. And we have lots of good examples of this, but I'm going to show you a few. So one is in lake physics. So this is where I talked right at the very beginning, if you remember that far back, about you can, in the summer, lakes will stratify and they have a warm upper layer called the epilimnion, and they have a very cold lower layer called the hypolimnion. Well, in 2012, if you remember, was that very early ice off, we got a very thin and kind of warm hypolimnion and a very deep and pretty hot epilimnion. And in 2013, with a really late ice off, you can see how different these two plots look from top to bottom, right? You have a very shallow epilimnion and a very kind of thick and cold hypolimnion. And what this means is that in 2012, you really didn't have much habitat for cold water fish that like to be down deep in the cold water. In 2013, you have a ton of habitat. So you have very different lakes, really, from year to year based on when ice off occurred. We also see the effects of ice off memory on biology in lakes. So these are just showing phytoplankton from top to bottom, phytoplankton abundance, rotifer abundance. Those are those little guys I showed you along back for the under ice stuff. Those are the kind of the initial things that show up in the spring, and they're the kind of smallest zooplankton we have. And then Cladocera abundance. Those are those water fleas, those Daphnia, those big guys that I showed you at the very start of the talk. And what we see is that if you look at early ice off, which are these red lines and red curves, and average ice off, which is gray, and then the late ice off, which is blue, it's affecting both the timing and the abundance of these different organisms, right? So phytoplankton, they just kind of track along with whether ice off's early or late, but you do get earlier phytoplankton peaks in an early year and late phytoplankton peaks in a late year. Rotifers do something really weird. In early years, they have this huge peak in abundance. They're getting started way before everybody else. There's not much competition and they just take off, right? So they're really taking over a lake in early years. And in late years, conversely, you see this the red curve, or the blue curve way down here. There is not much there aren't many rotifers happening in late years, which is pretty interesting. And Cladocera abundance is the same thing. So those Daphnia in an early year, they get kind of a decent peak. It's a little bit earlier than usual. Average year, you get the most of them. And then in a late year, this blue kind of peak down at the bottom, you actually don't get as many Cladocerans, and they're much later than expected. So these ice off conditions are also affecting the timing and the abundance of these different aspects of the food web. So the reason this matters, these changes in timing and abundance, is because it can lead to mismatches in the overlap between predators and prey. And so what I mean by that, I'm going to show you a cartoon to kind of give you an idea. So here we have on the left are just kind of abundance curves, like I just showed you, of different taxa. And then we have a fake lake here on the right with some ice on top. So in a normal year, the dashed line is when ice off occurs. Ice goes off, the light penetrates the water column. You get a nice big bloom of algae, which is green appropriately, right? And then the zooplankton hatch out of their resting eggs, and they come up and they eat the algae. They're all happy. And then the fish hatch, and they're running around and they're eating the zooplankton, and they're happy, right? So you have this really nice progression of events. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next. There's food around for every new component of the food web as it arrives. And then the system kind of works. Energy flows through that food web up to the apex predators, in this case, walleye. Now, if you change that and say you have a very early ice off, so let's slide ice off way off to the left here. Now, say you have light, and that light spurs algae right away. But the zooplankton don't come around right away, and the algae will actually kind of eat themselves out of house and home. They'll use up a lot of the nutrients. They'll start to die off too early, and suddenly there's not enough food around to promote a lot of zooplankton production and survival. And that causes even more problems when the fish show up and there's not enough food for the fish either. So you might get not much survival, and you might also get smaller fish. They don't grow as well. And that's what I mean by a mismatch, right? Here, the production of algae was mistimed with everything else. So you get this mismatch, you get this break in the food web, this break in the food chain, and that results in poor outcomes, especially if you're interested in lots of fish production or lots of zooplankton production. And we've seen mismatches show up in a lot of different types of ecosystems. This is not just a lake thing, right? So these are just some graphs for some papers, but we see them in terrestrial ecosystems. So when caribou migrate in the Arctic, And if they don't time their migration with when certain plants are kind of coming up and emerging to provide food, they'll actually end up producing fewer calves, which is pretty interesting. There's a ton of research on lots of different bird species that if birds don't time the hatching of their young with the peak abundances of insect prey, they'll actually produce fewer fledglings, which is what this plot is showing here. So this is timing is right in the middle and timing is not right on either side. And in fish, there's lots of examples as well. This is a good one where this red line on the far right here, plot here is the condition of baby herring in the Atlantic. And the blue line is their food, this Calanus copepod, the zooplankton. And you really don't see condition pick up until you see a big peak in Calanus production, right? So it's until they have enough food, they're really not doing too hot. So those mismatches become really important for informing how well these fish grow and survive. So we wanted to ask a few questions about what the effects of increasingly unpredictable phenology were on walleye. I've already talked a little bit about walleye. They're probably the most pursued fish in the state. So they're incredibly recreational important. They're traditionally important to the Ojibwe peoples of northern Wisconsin as well. And I think probably a lot of people have heard about this in the news, but their recruitment has been going down. So basically the number of baby fish walleye producing has been going down for a number of years. And a lot of lakes now are stocked that didn't used to have to be stocked. So these declines have been causing a lot of concern for a lot of folks across the state. So just to give you a little primer on walleye spawning ecology, they spawn in the spring, think of spring peepers again, as I talked about before. And they lay their eggs, and things like temperature and oxygen and predators will inform how many of those eggs survive. The eggs hatch into these little baby larval walleye, which kind of float around for a while before they settle down into the nearshore parts of the lake. And again, the survival of those are baby walleye are driven by things like temperature, food, and predators. So you start to see a lot of opportunities for mismatch, right? Mismatch with the right temperature, mismatch with the right food, maybe too much match with your predators, right? Can drive a lot of differences in walleye recruitment. So we wanted to ask a pretty basic question. We're seeing all this whiplash and ice off, and we're seeing these potentially more mismatches because of all this whiplash and ice off. So are walleye experiencing phenological whiplash? Are they having a hard time dealing with this new regime of highly unpredictable ice off in our lakes? And the questions are really simple. How are ice and walleye phenology changing over time? What drives the variation in phenology? So are different walleye lakes doing different things? And third, what are the effects of spawning phenology on walleye recruitment? Recruitment, again, is the kind of survival of baby walleye. So how are baby walleye doing in extreme versus kind of normal ice-off years? So I will not talk about this slide too much, but I did just kind of want to show you that we did scrape together a ton of data to think about this. So we have lots of data on ice-off dates, so that's observed and modeled ice-off dates. We have tons of data on walleye spawning phenology, and we took it from a ton of different places. We do spring walleye surveys in Wisconsin. We actually use tribal spearing data. We also did some egg takes. So we go out and catch female walleye and take eggs to then take back to the hatcheries to grow out. And that's a good indicator of when walleye are spawning because you're collecting the eggs at that time. And after all was said and done and the dust was settled, we managed to pull together data on 194 lakes in the upper Midwest. So that's Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And this is one of the larger phenology data sets, especially for fish, that you'll see. So it was really exciting to be able to do this on a very large kind of geographic scale and see whether the patterns we saw were in fact kind of global or whether there's a lot of among lake variability in what's happening. And again, I won't talk too much about the methods here, but the idea is that we're really just basically looking at how fast are things changing over time in terms of spawning phenology and ice-off phenology, how much variability there is. So that's, again, those kind of rolling standard 5-year variance or standard deviations that I showed you before. And then we also wanted to correlate ice and walleye phenology. And the question there is, are they changing at the same rate? Are walleye tracking ice? Or are they starting to diverge? Because that could cause some more issues in terms of those mismatches that we talked about. So we did a few other things. We also asked, how are walleye lakes different in their phenology changes? So are stocked versus naturally reproducing only lakes different in their phenology? Are warm lakes or cold lakes different in their phenology? And then last one, how does phenology influence recruitment? So the first thing I wanted to show you is this was the most basic question, is how things are changing across lakes. So just kind of orient you to this graph. When we first looked at ice off, all of these individual lines are the trends for individual lakes, and this black line on the bottom right plot here is the overall trend, the average trend. And what we saw, I think you could expect, ice off was getting earlier almost everywhere we looked over time. So that's what this kind of histogram of slopes is showing. It's less than 0, but the idea here is that almost all lakes that we looked at, ice off was getting earlier. What was interesting was that walleye phenology was not doing the same thing, which is kind of concerning right away, right? So again, all these are individual lakes. This black line is almost exactly 0. It's actually almost weird how close to 0 it was. You never see stuff land so closely to 0 in ecological data like this. But what this says is that walleye phenology is not changing in any systematic way. Some lakes are going up, some lakes are going down, getting later, getting earlier, and they really don't seem to be doing the same thing as ice off at all, which is a pretty interesting and pretty concerning result and not something we expected. The second thing we looked at is, again, how do walleye populations vary and how they're changing? And we saw 2 interesting things. One is that these cold, dark lakes, which is this top bar here, were shifting a little bit later, or excuse me, earlier. Or no, sorry, that's top lakes. Warm, dark lakes, excuse me, warm lakes were shifting later and cool lakes were shifting earlier. So actually had diverging trends depending on how kind of your average temperatures were in your lake. The other thing that we found that was pretty interesting to me was that lakes that were reliant entirely on stocking, in other words, they had no natural reproduction, were shifting in their spawning phenology later in the year. And lakes that were reliant only on, or not had no reliance on stocking, were only naturally reproduced, had no stocking in them, were shifting to spawn earlier in the year. So depending on whether those lakes were getting fish from a hatchery, actually seemed to they varied in their phenology, which is something we need to spend more time untangling. And then the last thing we found is that, phenology is becoming a lot more unpredictable in both walleye and ice phenologies. That's what these lines are showing. Again, that kind of rolling variance, and you see this big peak, especially after 2000. So when we get into the idea of mismatch and mismatch effects on recruitment, the first thing we did was just calculate a very simple index of mismatch, which is the number of days that passed between when the ice went off and when the walleye spawned. And that's, we think, is a pretty important indicator of mismatch, because we think that, that ice off is triggering all those kind of ecological events that I talked about that lead to a good walleye year class. And when you look across all the lakes, on average, the number of days is getting longer and longer over time. So as time passes, there are getting more and more days occurring between ice melt and walleye spawning. And this is the really big picture one here. This is the kind of top line result. Then when we asked, okay, how much does that mismatch affect the recruitment of walleye? So the number of baby walleye we see in the fall, there's a really, really strong negative relationship. And so here, there's virtually no points. So here is walleye recruitment on the y-axis and the number of mismatch in days on the x-axis. And there are no points in the top right of this graph. Whenever there was a lot of mismatch, a big difference between spawning and ice, recruitment was poor. And we only got good recruitment when mismatch was low. In other words, spawning and ice happened pretty close together. So this is a really big red flag that kind of phenological variability, that phenologic whiplash I'm talking about, is bad news for walleye, because it really seems to strongly affect walleye recruitment and the number of babies walleye that survive into the fall. So I think from this, we can really safely say that walleye, yes, are feeling the effects of phenological whiplash, right? These phenological extremes, these extreme going super early to super late to super early again, are exacerbating these mismatches for walleye recruits, and they're leading to poor survival of walleye. And the other thing that's concerning is that these mismatches are getting bigger and bigger. There seems to be a lag in the shift between how fast walleye can change and how fast ice off is changing. So maybe walleye are using different cues. Maybe they're just simply not able to adapt as fast as the climate is changing and as ice off timing is changing. And the third thing, there's still this really interesting aspect of these stocking practices and the differences in phenology between stocked lakes and not stocked lakes. Now, there's a lot of kind of chicken and an egg there, right? Maybe the lakes that maybe lakes were declining in recruitment because they weren't shifting fast enough and therefore needed to be stocked. Could be one reason to think about it. The second idea is that potentially stocking lakes with walleye leads to some kind of maladaptation, these kind of introduction of these new walleye that are maybe not adapted to the new kind of phenological regimes that are out there. And it's actually messing up the phenological response that walleye have to an ice off cue, for example. There's a lot of work in this in other species as well. So salmon are a really big one, and they found that hatchery practices over time can actually lead to the change in the timing of salmon runs out west. And now the question is, are we seeing that in walleye, and we need to do a lot more work on figuring out some of those issues. So just to kind of summarize, I have kind of 4 big picture things that hopefully folks can take away from this. And then again, I'm happy to answer questions. One, winter is a very dynamic time in Wisconsin lakes. You know, when you look out at a lake and it's covered with ice, it really matters what kind of ice that is, how thick it is, when it showed up, when it's going to melt, right? Because the lake is dynamically responding to that ice cover all the time, and it's going to change what the habitat looks like throughout the year. And what happens in winter affects how those lakes function, like I said, for the rest of the year. What happens under the ice can set up what happens after the ice melts. When the ice melts, sets up what habitats are available for the rest of the summer and fall. Lake ice phenology is getting earlier, but it's also getting more variable, and we're getting shorter and shorter ice seasons. And this is something that is a very, very clear trend. And the more variable part in particular is something we're going to be continuing to work on, because it seems like, again, those whiplash events seem to be having a very important effect on how lakes function. So these extreme phenology events seem to be driving more of these mismatches, these mistimings between different parts of the lake food web. And it leads to things like poor walleye recruitment. And that's walleye are the first species we look at this. And now we have to do a lot more work to really understand in a more holistic way how these phenological events, these extreme phenological events, are affecting lake food webs. So with that, I want to re-acknowledge a lot of the folks that did all the work on this talk, including folks from GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, DNR, CFL, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Point out some funders, especially DNR, North Temperate Lakes Long-Term Ecological Research, NSF, Wiki, and Sport Fish Aid and Restoration. And with that, I will thank you for your attention. My email is there. Do feel free to email me, but I'm also happy to stay and answer some questions for a while too. Thank you.
So thank you so much. First of all, this is so very, very interesting. We do have questions, and Paul is going to read those to you, Zach, to respond to. So Zach.
Okay.
All right, and Paul.
Thanks again for the presentation, Zach. So our first question we have here is from Phyllis Sachs. She says that we have a very shallow 10-foot max lake, about 152 acres. It's spring fed. When winter sets in, there's often a fear that because of the shallowness of the lake, that there might be a fish kill. Can you speak about the impacts to shallow lakes during winter freezes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. Winter fish kills are always a concern, especially when you have those shallow lakes, right? And especially when you have very productive shallow lakes, you get kind of the oxygen depletion that you get are concerned about under the ice. I think that's something that we really haven't, admittedly, looked into a ton yet in terms of how shallow lakes versus very deep lakes differ in kind of the habitat. We've thought a lot about these kind of larger lakes, because that's where a lot of our research stations are. But in terms of the shallow lakes, you know, it could be that some of the issues with fish kills are ameliorated with shorter ice seasons, because you get more kind of mixing. But it also could be that, you know, you have if you have warmer summers and you maybe have more production, you get more issues during the summertime. So I think it could be kind of a two-edged sword in terms of what climate change is going to do in shallow lakes. There's a lot of really great shallow lakes research being done at the CFL. And I do think winter is still a little bit of a blind spot in our shallow lakes or our shallow lakes research program, but it's something that we certainly need to address, because those are real, very real concerns, and they could have very different effects than, you know, we see in deep lakes.
Thanks, Zach. Our next question is from Deborah. It has to do with the use of aerators, especially around piers that stay in place during the winter. What is the impact of those aerators? And does that sort of have a impact on prolonging the growth cycle, particularly of algae?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it certainly could, especially if those aerators, are keeping the ice, from forming. You're allowing more light through there. I mean, I think it depends on how large the aerator system is versus how large the lake is, right? It might have local effects, but on the lake-wide scale, maybe it wouldn't have too strong of an effect versus, you have some lakes where we put aerators in and actually mix the whole lake, and that might have a very different effect because you're actually in some ways preventing that lake from freezing fully. And there you might see some of the impacts that we talked about there. So I think it would depend a little bit. But on a local scale, I would expect that you might have some of the same effects. If you're keeping the ice thin or keeping it from freezing at all, you're allowing that light through. And that light is going to help promote growth of more algae and potentially more zooplankton as well. Would be my hypothesis anyway. Yeah.
Our next question is from Rick Peace. With future intermittent ice conditions, what will the increase in evaporation rates with no ice due to our lake levels?
That is a very, very good question that I will admit I am not super. That is a little bit outside of my expertise. I think it would really depend on the kind of lake you have. If it's a seepage lake versus a drainage lake, right? What their water source is, what the kind of flows are, and the retention times are. My sense would that be that those may have stronger effects, like the current controls on water levels, whether changes in like the depth of the water table, inputs and outputs, stuff like that, might have a stronger effect than evaporation effects. But I will admit I'm not a hydrologist, so that would be my best guess. But I think that would be a fantastic question to bring to some of the other folks at CFL and see what they think. Yeah, I'd be kind of curious about the answer to that one myself.
Our next question is from Zach Stewart. It's sort of going back to some of the talk about how light penetration might influence algal growth. Similarly, with invasive curlyleaf pondweed and perhaps other invasive species, do they gain a competitive advantage over native macrophytes by growing earlier in the season under clear ice cover?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you touch on a different research program of mine. I actually have a whole separate project that's all about macrophytes in lakes and how they are serve as fish habitat, but also kind of what they're doing in response to climate change. And curlyleaf is a cool one, right? Because they have a very weird phenology compared to a lot of our native species where they grow really early. And yeah, you could potentially see these kind of priority effects where you get very early growth of whether it's curlyleaf or maybe there's some other native plants that are also early growers that get an even bigger head start on native plants. And you might see very different plant communities from year to year because of that. So it's kind of the same idea as some of the zooplankton and algae work I showed. A lot of times it can depend on where you start kind of affects where you go. So you could very easily see those kind of phenology effects in macrophytes as well. It's a fascinating question, and we're just starting to dig into it, but it's a really, really good point.
So thanks, Zach. So our last question here, it sort of has to do with, I think a lot of us have been told or have sort of recognized that lakes are, quote unquote, dying or have had some significant impacts to them in recent decades. How true does this play into this analysis, and does this sort of support that lakes in general are sort of deteriorating?
I think it may depend on what your definition of deteriorating is. I hesitate to call it deteriorating because I think we're doing a lot of things to improve water quality in a lot of lakes, and we have a lot of tools, I think, that try and work with water quality in a lot of lakes. I think what we're doing is I like to think of it as less deterioration, but moving into something new or something different. We're really probably transitioning into a different kind of of ecosystem, because the climate change angle in particular is very hard to grapple with, right? Like at a local level, you know, your lake association, it's really hard to change how much carbon's in the atmosphere. But there are other things you can do at the local level, right? You can think about land use change. You can do invasive species removals or prevention programs, right? Can do things like improve habitat, whether it's coarse woody habitat or thinking about development of the lake and the lake shore, right? So I think there are a lot of local level things that are still possible to kind of help manage this transition. But you're right, you know, in a lot of ways, we're kind of moving into uncharted territory in terms of what the climate is doing to our lakes. And it's really going to come down to what happens in the next few decades in terms of how we handle that transition. So I hesitate to call it dying. I think it's more of a transition, and maybe we're moving into something new, and there may be opportunities to land in a better place than we might think. It's just really going to take a lot of kind of forward thinking about what we do, when we do it, how we do it, that kind of thing in terms of our management responses.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. You know, what I wish, Zach, is that we could open up all of the sounds of people, giving a round of applause to you for presenting this research. It's totally fascinating. And so thank you very much from all of us. And I'm going to ask John if he'll step back into our area and talk. We're going to take some questions also about what you see or want to know about Lake Country Clean Waters. That would be directly, you know, involving that. Do you have questions of us about future things that we're doing or that kind of thing? So John, would you take it away? And also, I think, recognize Zach again, because that was really good.
Absolutely, Carolyn. And I do want to thank Zach for that extremely interesting presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I certainly will look at the frozen tundra a little bit differently all winter long. Keep an eye on the snow, keeping an eye on the ice, and ice on, ice off type of concepts. I think it all will mean a lot more to us now that we understand the significance of it. And I hope everyone here, you know, learned a lot. I do want to thank, while I'm talking, I'm hoping you're typing in your questions. That'll be read to the board members and to myself, and we'll see if we can try to answer them. I want to thank Carolyn, Joyce, and Paul for putting this program together. It was a great job, and I think it went well. I have every reason to believe that we have the largest attendance we've ever had at any one of our quarterly meetings, and that's a special thank you to all of you who have attended. As we told you early on, we're a 501c3. We run entirely on donated funds. We have no federal money, state monies. So your contribution is used totally toward running these programs and you know, toward the conservation of Wisconsin's beautiful and important waterways. So please consider donating to our organization. What, if any, questions do we have? Paul?
How did anyone?
We no additional questions, just another thank you to Zach for a wonderful presentation.
And also a big heart. So I mean, so there are the kisses and hearts. So that was really great.
As we indicated, our next meeting is scheduled for March 7th at the same time. We originally had wanted to have a balanced approach to the wake boat issue. We're now going to monitor that for the next few weeks to see what we can find out about whether the science will be available. We'll also be monitoring where we're at on the proposed legislation, and the board will be making a decision shortly as to whether we'll stick with that topic, as Joyce has pointed out, or whether we'll move on. So with that being said, this is your organization. We do this for you. We do this for your lake, and we want your input. If you have any topics that you would like us to consider using at the quarterly meeting or the Healthy Lakes Conference, please type them into the chat now before you leave, and we'll certainly give them due consideration because we want your input. We want these programs to be on the topics that are of interest to you and will be helpful to you. So with that, Carolyn, I turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much for attending. And it's really wonderful to see all the names. I recognize so many of you. And I wish you, a happy winter, and watch that ice on your lakes. That's what I think we should be doing. So long, everybody. And thank you very, very much for coming.